Today, we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. While the first story is a claustrophobic person's worst nightmare, the second one in particular features a caver who, despite knowing he is on borrowed time, kept going inside the cave, eventually meeting his tragic end. As always, viewer discretion is advised. It was June 2nd, 2004, when 9 teenagers gathered at the entrance of Tongue River Cave in Wyoming, ready for what they thought would be an easy adventure. Barry Blaha and Dana Herbert, both 16, had convinced their friends to explore the underground cave system that Saturday afternoon. None of them had any real caving experience, but they were confident they could handle whatever waited in the darkness below. The teenagers had brought a collection of cheap flashlights, batteries, and a few headlamps they'd borrowed from camping gear, thinking that would be plenty of illumination for their underground exploration. They had no helmets, no proper caving equipment, and definitely no understanding of how dangerous cave systems could be when things went wrong. The group entered the cave in single file, as they made their way deeper into the mountain's belly, laughing and joking about how cool this was going to be. The main passage was spacious at first, allowing them to walk upright and move around easily, with plenty of room for the entire group to spread out and explore different sections of the cavern. As they ventured deeper into the cave system, the teenagers discovered multiple side passages branching off from the main tunnel. Some passages led to dead ends, so they had to turn back and go discover other ones. In all this time, the cave walls showed signs of water damage and erosion, with loose rocks and unstable sections that should have been warning signs to experienced cave explorers, but the teenagers were too excited to notice the danger. As they ventured deeper, Barry's excitement spiked when he noticed something others had missed. Hidden in the shadows was a narrow crack in the wall that seemed to lead further into the cave system. This wasn't on any map. This could be their discovery. This could make them famous among their friends. The group crowded around the opening, shining their lights into the narrow passage beyond. The walls here were different from the main tunnel. The rock looked fractured and unstable, held together by nothing more than gravity and time. Small stones scattered when touched. But the teenagers saw none of these danger signs. All they saw was adventure. The excitement of youth and the thrill of discovery drove Barry and Dana to push further into this narrowing passage, while their friends explored other areas of the cave system. They squeezed through sections that required them to turn sideways, then crawl on their hands and knees, and finally army crawl on their bellies as the passage continued to constrict around them. Their flashlight beams revealed that the tunnel kept going even further. The narrowest section of the passage was barely 45 centimeters, 18 inches wide, and 60 centimeters, 24 inches tall, creating a slot-like opening that would challenge even experienced spelunkers with proper equipment and training. Barry, who was slightly smaller than Dana, had squeezed into this section first, with Dana following close behind him through the claustrophobic space. The walls pressed against them from all sides, and they had to exhale completely just to make any forward progress through the restriction. Barry reached a point where the passage became impossibly tight. The walls closed in so much that he couldn't squeeze his body through no matter how he positioned himself. The smart choice was obvious: turn around and crawl back out. They could explore other parts of the cave. Barry's teenage impatience and determination to continue exploring overrode any caution he might have exercised in the situation, and he decided to try clearing the obstruction by moving some of the smaller rocks out of his way. He managed to work one arm free in the tight space and grabbed a rock about the size of a softball that seemed to be part of the blockage. Without thinking about the consequences or understanding how cave systems worked, he began using this rock as a hammer, striking the larger stones ahead of him in an attempt to break them apart or knock them loose. Growing more desperate by the minute, each impact sent vibrations through the surrounding stone. Dust began raining down from the ceiling above them. The cave system had stood for thousands of years, but it had never been attacked like this. The fractured rock formation was held in place by a delicate balance. Each blow from Barry's makeshift hammer was disturbing that balance, sending stress waves through the unstable ceiling above. What happened next was every spelunker's worst nightmare. A deep, thunderous crack echoed through the passage. The sound was followed immediately by the grinding of shifting stones. A massive boulder, later estimated at over 300 pounds, 136 kilograms, broke free from the ceiling and crashed down directly behind Dana. The impact was devastating. The entire passage shook violently. A choking cloud of dust and debris filled the air. When the dust finally settled and the echoes faded, the horrible truth became clear. The fallen boulder had completely sealed the passage behind them. Barry and Dana were trapped in a space barely larger than a coffin. The claustrophobic nightmare that followed was beyond human endurance. Barry found himself pressed against the narrowest section of the passage, his chest compressed so tightly that every breath was a struggle. Behind him, Dana was wedged between his feet and the massive boulder that had become their prison wall. Her breathing became rapid and shallow as panic consumed her. When they turned off their flashlights to save battery, the darkness was absolute. The silence was broken only by their labored breathing and the distant muffled shouts of their friends on the other side of the boulder. They were buried alive, surrounded by tons of rock that could shift and crush them at any moment. Their friends immediately tried to move the boulder, but their efforts were hopeless. The stone might as well have been part of the mountain itself. Their desperate attempts to dig around it only highlighted how impossible the situation had become. Every scraping sound and frustrated shout added to the psychological torture of the trapped teens. Minutes crawled by like hours. The hard stone pressed into their bodies at every point, cutting off circulation and creating agonizing pressure. The air in their tiny prison grew stale and warm from their breathing. Each breath felt insufficient. Muscle cramps set in from forced immobility, adding another layer of suffering. The psychological effects were worse than the physical pain. Thousands of tons of rock pressed down above them. Every small sound became terrifying in their heightened state of fear. The settling of stones, the drip of water, the scurrying of unseen creatures. Time lost all meaning in the absolute darkness. They began to wonder if they would die here, their bodies never to be found. Their friends made the critical decision to race back through the cave system to get help. Several of them ran to the surface and immediately called emergency services. The call went out to Sheridan County rescue personnel, who began mobilizing specialized equipment for what they knew would be a difficult operation. The rescue effort was a battle against time and physics. Professional rescuers arrived with powerful winches, hydraulic jacks, and specialized tools designed for cave emergencies. But even with professional equipment, moving a 300-pound boulder in a narrow cave passage presented enormous challenges. Rescuers had to work in shifts, with only 1 or 2 people able to access the work area at a time. Every tool had to be carried through the cave system by hand. There was constant fear that their efforts might trigger another rockfall that would make the situation even worse. The unstable rock formation meant every movement had to be carefully calculated. Hours passed. The rescue became a race against death. The longer Barry and Dana remained trapped, the greater the risk of serious medical complications from compression and restricted breathing. Hypothermia was also a threat, as the cave's constant cool temperature could quickly lower their body temperatures to dangerous levels. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rescuers positioned their winch system to move the massive boulder. The operation required precise coordination and extreme care to avoid destabilizing the surrounding rocks. Slowly, inch by terrifying inch, the 300-pound stone was pulled away from the passage. The moment Barry and Dana could finally move again was indescribable relief mixed with agony. Their muscles, cramped from hours of immobility, barely functioned as they were carefully extracted from the narrow passage. The journey back through the cave system felt like being reborn, each step taking them further from their underground nightmare. They emerged from Tongue River Cave at approximately 10:30 p.m., nearly 8 hours after entering what they thought would be a simple afternoon adventure. This next story is a result of overconfidence, where the caver already knew he's taking a big risk, but still went on to try his luck. It was August 21st, 2004. Brian Tyndale and 3 friends rolled into Ginny Springs around 8:30 p.m. on a Friday night. The 24-year-old had been diving for 3 years and logged over 100 open water dives. This weekend was supposed to be their escape from Tallahassee, camping, diving, and having a good time at one of Florida's most famous springs. They set up camp quickly. 2 friends grabbed the canoe while another got ready to snorkel. Brian had bigger plans. He wanted to check out the underwater cave entrances that made Devil's Ear famous. Little Devil, Devil's Eye, and the main Devil's Ear entrance all beckoned from below. The spring was about 30 meters, 100 feet across, with crystal clear water that stayed at 22 degrees Celsius, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. At night, the underwater lights created an almost magical glow beneath the surface. The limestone walls dropped straight down, and you could see everything perfectly. It was like looking through glass. Brian geared up with his standard open water equipment. His tank showed 500 psi. Not full, but plenty for what he had planned. He grabbed his single D-cell flashlight and did his final checks. His friends pushed off in the canoe, while the snorkelers slipped into the water. The first dive took Brian down to Little Devil at 9 meters, 30 feet deep, where the entrance appeared deceptively small from above, but opened into something truly spectacular. The entrance was tight and required careful maneuvering, but it opened up into this incredible cathedral-like chamber inside that took his breath away. He poked his head cautiously inside the opening, swept his light beam around the limestone formations and flowstone decorations, then headed back up to the surface to share his excitement. The visibility was absolutely insane, better than any dive site he had experienced in his 3 years of diving, with clarity that seemed almost supernatural. After catching his breath at the surface, Brian went for Devil's Eye. This one was deeper at 12 meters, 40 feet, with a bigger entrance that looked like a perfect oval. He swam just inside the threshold of the opening, and his light revealed multiple tunnels disappearing into complete and absolute darkness, like doorways to another world beneath the earth. The silence down there was incredible and almost overwhelming. Nothing but the gentle sound of his breathing apparatus and the soft percussion of bubbles floating up toward the distant surface. Back on the surface, his friends paddled their canoe over to hear detailed reports about what he'd discovered in the underwater realm below. Brian was absolutely pumped and filled with adrenaline from what he'd seen, describing the caves as even cooler and more spectacular than he'd expected, and the water so incredibly clear he felt like he was flying through liquid air instead of swimming. As the night progressed and the hours slipped by, Brian made several more short dives to different sections of the spring, each time getting more confident and excited about exploring these underwater passages that seemed to call to him. His air supply was steadily decreasing with each dive, but he had one more spot he absolutely wanted to check out before calling it a night. The main Devil's Ear entrance itself, the crown jewel of the entire cave system. Around 2 a.m., Brian checked his pressure gauge one final time and saw the needle pointing to a level that indicated about 12 minutes of air remaining. According to him, it was definitely enough for one quick reconnaissance dive to Devil's Ear itself, just to see what the main entrance looked like from the inside. He told his friends confidently that he'd be right back up to the surface, just a quick peek at the famous entrance, and then they could pack up and call it a successful night of exploration. Devil's Ear opened up at 6 meters, 20 feet deep, revealing an entranceway bigger and more impressive than the other cave openings he'd explored that evening. This was the real deal, the main highway into the massive and complex cave system that stretched for miles underground throughout North Florida's limestone bedrock. Brian dropped down through the water column and swam confidently inside, his single light beam beginning to probe the darkness that had never seen sunlight. The passage was huge at first, with his light barely reaching the walls and ceiling. Limestone formations covered everything, and the sand on the bottom swirled around his fins. He kept swimming deeper, following the main tunnel as it curved away from the entrance. Then the ceiling started getting lower. The passage narrowed into what looked like a tight squeeze, maybe 1.2 meters, 4 feet across. Beyond it, his light showed another chamber, dome-shaped and just big enough for a diver to fit through. Brian figured he could make it. He'd squeezed through tight spots before, during his open water dives. He positioned himself carefully and started threading through the restriction, pushing with his fins and pulling with his arms. Halfway through, something went horribly wrong. His tank valve caught on something in the ceiling. He tried to back out, but he was stuck. He pushed forward, still stuck. The more he struggled, the tighter he got wedged in the opening. His movements kicked up sand and silt from the cave floor. In seconds, the water around him turned into a brown cloud. His single flashlight, which had seemed plenty bright before, now barely cut through the murky mess he'd created. Brian's heart started racing. He was trapped in a space barely wider than his body, with limestone pressing in from all sides. Every movement seemed to wedge him tighter. His breathing got faster, burning through what little air he had left. The restriction held him like a vice. Above and below, the cave stretched endlessly in all directions. His light flickered across the silt-filled water, showing nothing but brown murk. The silence that had seemed peaceful before now felt suffocating. He could feel his air getting thinner with each breath. The gauge needle dropped toward empty as panic took over completely. The walls wouldn't budge. The ceiling wouldn't move. He was locked in place in the darkness, 20 feet underwater and 50 feet inside a cave with no way out. Up on the surface, his three friends kept waiting. The canoe drifted slowly across the spring while they watched for Brian's light or bubbles to appear. The snorkeler floated nearby, occasionally diving down to look for any sign of their friend. Minutes ticked by, then more minutes. The time Brian had said he'd be down came and went. They started calling his name across the water, hoping he'd pop up somewhere they couldn't see. But the surface of Devil's Ear stayed perfectly calm. No bubbles, no light moving around below. No Brian. The three friends looked at each other with rapidly growing panic and dread, their casual evening of fun suddenly turning into their worst nightmare. Something was definitely and seriously wrong with the situation, way beyond just Brian taking a little longer than expected. They paddled as hard as they could for the limestone shore, dragged their aluminum canoe roughly up on the bank without regard for scratches, and ran frantically through the darkness toward the Ginny Springs facility to get emergency help. A Ginny Springs diving instructor received the frantic emergency call and responded immediately to the desperate situation. Unlike Brian, this experienced professional had all the proper cave diving gear that was essential for safe underground exploration. Multiple powerful lights with backup batteries, safety guidelines, specialized equipment, and most importantly, years of intensive training for exactly these types of rescue situations that unfortunately occurred too often at cave diving sites. He geared up with practiced efficiency and dropped into Devil's Ear Spring, his powerful lights cutting through the crystal clear water as he descended toward the main cave entrance. His experience told him exactly where recreational divers usually got into trouble, and he swam methodically toward the back sections of the cave system, following the route he knew untrained divers typically took when they got in over their heads. He'd performed rescues like this before throughout his career, and sadly he had a pretty good idea where to look for Brian based on the typical patterns of these tragic incidents. The restriction came into clear view in his bright light beam, and there, wedged impossibly tight in the narrow opening, with his arms reaching desperately toward the dome chamber beyond, the instructor found exactly what Brian's friends had been dreading to discover. The diving instructor worked carefully to free Brian from the restriction. It took several minutes of precise movements to maneuver his tank valve away from the limestone ceiling where it had caught. Once free, the instructor was able to pull Brian's body back through the narrow opening and into the main passage. Swimming alone through the cave system, the instructor carried Brian toward the entrance of Devil's Ear. The journey back to the surface took about 10 minutes, navigating carefully through the underwater passages with his powerful lights. When he finally emerged at the spring's surface, Brian's three friends were waiting anxiously on shore, hoping for better news than what they were about to receive. Brian's three friends were devastated when the diving instructor surfaced with their companion's lifeless body. What had started as an exciting weekend camping trip at one of Florida's most beautiful springs had turned into their worst nightmare.